Michael Whitmore grabbed Eleanor's wrist so hard she flinched, and through his teeth he whispered, "You are not going to that gala. You are going to the Hamptons, and you are going to stay there." He released her, like she was something he was done with. Then he straightened his jacket, picked up his phone, and texted his mistress, "Tonight, the world sees us together." He had no idea that at that exact moment across the city, the Waldorf Astoria's event director was hanging a banner that read, "Tonight's guest of honor, Eleanor Hayes Whitmore. Comment below what city you're watching from. Subscribe and don't miss a single second of what happens next." Michael Whitmore had the rule. He lived by a rule he had never said out loud, but followed with the discipline of a man who believed in it down to his bones. The rule was this: control the room and you control everything in it. He had built his entire life around that principle. Every boardroom he walked into, every deal he closed, every handshake he extended across a mahogany table in some glass tower above Manhattan, all of it traced back to that single idea: control the narrative, control the perception, control what people see when they look at you. And for 48 years it had worked. Michael Whitmore was not just wealthy. He was mythologically wealthy, the kind of rich that stops feeling like money and starts feeling like gravity, like something invisible that pulls everything toward you, whether you ask for it or not. He had started Whitmore Capital Group at 31 with 2 partners and a borrowed office in Midtown, and by 40 he had swallowed 3 of his competitors, whole absorbed their assets, their clients, their reputations, and left nothing behind but his own name on the door. The financial press called him ruthless. He called himself efficient. His wife called him something else entirely, though she rarely said it out loud. His wife, Eleanor Hayes Whitmore. If you had asked anyone in the Whitmore social circle to describe Eleanor, they would have smiled pleasantly and said something like gracious or elegant or exactly the kind of woman a man like Michael needs. They would have meant it as a compliment. They would not have realized they were describing wallpaper. That was how Eleanor had been seen for 12 years, as the backdrop, as the tasteful, expensive, perfectly maintained backdrop to Michael Whitmore's extraordinary life. She organized the dinner parties that his clients attended and left raving about. She knew the name of every senator's wife, every hedge fund manager's favorite wine, every cardinal rule of Upper Manhattan social navigation. She could walk into a room full of strangers and within 20 minutes have 3 of them convinced they had known her for years. She had once at a state dinner redirected a conversation that was careening toward a political disaster so smoothly that the 2 men involved hadn't even realized what she'd done until 3 days later. Michael knew she was capable. He just didn't think it mattered. Because in his mind, in the private, unexamined, unchallenged mind of a man who had never been told he was wrong about anything important, Eleanor's capabilities existed to serve his life. Her intelligence was a tool. Her connections were an asset. Her grace was a product he had in some way he never fully articulated helped create. He was wrong about all of it. But the morning the wrong started to matter, Michael didn't know it yet. I was standing in the kitchen of their Westchester estate, the one with the 12-foot ceilings and the garden that Eleanor had designed herself, and the chef she had hired, and the staff she managed, and the atmosphere she had built, piece by careful piece over the better part of a decade. He was standing there in his suit, already dressed for a 7 a.m. meeting, holding a cup of coffee he hadn't made, reading a message on his phone he didn't want Eleanor to see. The message was from Olivia. "Confirmed for Saturday. Can't wait. The dress is perfect." Michael smiled. He put the phone face down on the counter. Then he looked up and found Eleanor standing in the doorway to the kitchen, already dressed herself, holding a folder he didn't recognize, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable pause. Eleanor was never uncomfortable. That was one of the things about her that had over the years shifted from charming to quietly unnerving. She inhabited silence the way other people inhabited conversation, with complete ease, with no apparent need to fill it. "You're up early," Michael said. "I have a meeting." He frowned. "With who?" "Some people," she said. "You wouldn't know them." He looked at the folder. "What's that?" She glanced down at it as if she'd briefly forgotten she was holding it. "Research," she said. "For a project." "What kind of project?" She looked at him for a moment, and there was something in her eyes, not anger, not accusation, nothing that pointed or sharp, just a kind of quiet assessment, the look of someone measuring a distance they've already decided to cross. "A long-term one," she said. Then she poured herself coffee, picked up her bag, kissed him on the cheek with the practiced warmth of 12 years of marriage, and walked out. Michael watched her go. He thought about asking more questions. He decided it wasn't worth the time. He had a meeting of his own to get to, and he had a gala to plan. The Hope Future Foundation Charity Gala was by any reasonable measure one of the most important social events in New York's calendar. Not because of the money raised, though the money raised was staggering. Not because of the guest list, though the guest list read like a directory of everyone who mattered in finance, politics, entertainment, and philanthropy. It was important because of what it meant to be seen there, and more specifically what it meant to be seen there with the right person. Michael had attended every year for the past 9 years. Every year Eleanor had come with him. She had stood beside him in rooms full of people twice as famous and 10 times as powerful, and she had made him look good. She had laughed at the right moments, deflected questions with elegant precision, remembered names that Michael had forgotten within seconds, and at the end of every evening in the car on the way home, given him a quiet and accurate summary of every conversation that had mattered and what he should do about each one. He had taken all of that for granted in a way so complete, so total, so utterly unexamined that he had no idea how much of his social standing was built on her foundation rather than his own. This year he had decided Eleanor wouldn't come. It was not a difficult decision for him. It required almost no internal negotiation. He had simply looked at the invitation on his desk, thought about Olivia in that red dress she'd described, thought about the cameras and the press and the 600 guests, and the way it would feel to walk into the Waldorf Astoria with a 27-year-old woman on his arm who looked at him like he was the most impressive man she'd ever encountered, and he had decided. The conversation with Eleanor was, he told himself, a formality. He found her in the study that evening. She was at her desk reading something he again didn't recognize, making notes in a small leather-bound journal. She had 3 of those journals he had noticed. He had never asked what was in them. "The gala is Saturday," he said from the doorway. She looked up. "I know. I've been thinking." He walked into the room, chose a chair that was slightly too far from her desk, a positioning he was not conscious of, but that put a careful distance between them. "You've been saying lately that you find these events draining, all the small talk, the same people, the same conversations." Eleanor said nothing. She set down her pen. "I think it might be better," Michael continued, "if you sat this one out, took the weekend for yourself. You could go to the house in the Hamptons. The weather's supposed to be good." He had practiced that. He was pleased with how reasonable it sounded. Eleanor looked at him, that unreadable look again, that quiet, measuring assessment. "You want me to go to the Hamptons," she said, "while you attend the gala. I think it would be good for you to have some time." "Michael." Her voice was not sharp. It was not angry. It was something almost worse than both perfectly, absolutely calm. "Is there something you want to tell me?" The question sat in the room like a physical object. Michael's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "Okay," Eleanor said. She picked up her pen. She went back to her notes. "I'll make arrangements for the Hamptons," she said without looking up. "Have a good evening at the gala." And that was it. No argument, no scene, no tears, no accusations, no slamming of the door, no thrown objects, nothing that he could have pointed to as unreasonable or excessive. Just that single question, "Is there something you want to tell me?" hanging in the air, and then her pen moving across the page, as if the conversation had concluded entirely to her satisfaction. Michael walked back to his office, feeling like he'd won something. He didn't understand yet that Eleanor didn't argue about things she had already decided. He had met Olivia Parker at a conference 14 months ago. She was 27, a communications specialist who worked for a mid-sized PR firm that handled several of Whitmore Capital's media accounts. She was brilliant, quick, and possessed of a particular talent that Michael had not encountered in a very long time, the talent of making him feel in the middle of an ordinary conversation about something completely mundane, like the most interesting person in the room. It wasn't manipulation exactly. Or if it was the kind of manipulation that wears the clothing of genuine admiration, so convincingly that you'd need a very sharp eye to tell the difference. Olivia listened to Michael in a way that Eleanor, after 12 years, simply did not anymore. Not because Eleanor was indifferent, but because Eleanor had seen behind the performance and loved the complicated, difficult man underneath it, which is a much more demanding and much less flattering kind of attention. Olivia gave Michael the mirror he wanted. Eleanor gave him the truth he needed. And like most people who are given the choice, he preferred the mirror. The affair had begun 6 months in. Michael had told himself in the early stages that it was nothing serious, a distraction, a temporary indulgence, the kind of thing that happened to men of his age and position and stress level, and that didn't have to mean anything larger about his character or his marriage or his life. Then he had rented Olivia an apartment in a building 6 blocks from his midtown office and started spending 3 nights a week there, and it became harder to maintain the fiction of insignificance. But he maintained it anyway, because he was a man who believed in his own ability to control narratives, and the narrative he most needed to control was the one he told himself. What Michael did not know, what he could not have imagined, because it would have required him to look at Eleanor as something other than a supporting character in his own story, was that Eleanor had known about Olivia for 4 months. She had not known immediately. She had not hired a private investigator, had not rifled through his phone, had not done any of the things that would later be assumed when the story became public. She had simply noticed, as she had always noticed things, the particular quality of Michael's absence. Not the fact of it, he had always worked long hours, had always had dinners and meetings and weekend obligations, but the texture of it, the way his phone went to another room at night, the way he no longer mentioned certain client names that had previously come up constantly, the way he looked at her when he looked at her with a very specific kind of guilt that a man shows when he has convinced himself he has done nothing wrong. She had confirmed her suspicions through a combination of patient's observation and several conversations she'd had over the past year with people who knew more than they realized they were telling her. And then she had made a decision. Not the decision Michael would have expected. Not a confrontation. Not a lawyer's call. Not any of the dramatic interventions that most people in her position would have pursued immediately. Eleanor's decision was something much larger and much more considered. She was going to finish what she had started. The project she had been building for 5 years, quietly, carefully, in the margins of a marriage that had slowly and systematically underestimated her, was almost ready. And when it was ready, it would not need Michael's approval, or Michael's name, or Michael's world to exist. It would simply exist, and that would be answer enough. Thomas Reyes had been Eleanor's primary financial advisor for 7 years. How was 63 a man of such consistent professional discretion that he had once been described in Forbes as the most trusted man in private wealth management that most people have never heard of, which was exactly the kind of description he preferred. He had known for the better part of 4 years about the project Eleanor was building. He had helped structure it. He had introduced her to 4 of the 8 partners who now anchored it. He had on more than one occasion sat across from her in a conference room and felt the particular professional satisfaction of watching someone operate several levels above where they were expected to. How was the one who called her on the Tuesday before the gala? "Victoria Collins called me today," he said. Eleanor was in her car heading to a meeting in the city. "What did she say?" "She wants to give you the award Saturday." A pause. "The Changemaker Award," Eleanor said. "The Maker of Hope Award," Thomas corrected. "It's the top one. She said it's been unanimous. The board has been aware of the Hayes Foundation's work for the past 8 months, and they want to make it public." Another pause, longer this time. "At the gala," Eleanor said. "At the gala." Eleanor looked out the window. The city slid past. She thought about Michael telling her the gala wasn't right for her, wasn't her kind of event, thought she should go to the Hamptons. She thought about the way he'd said it so smooth, so confident, so certain of her compliance. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," Thomas confirmed. "Victoria wants to know if you'll accept." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Tell her yes," she said. "And Michael will be there," Eleanor said. "He just won't be expecting me." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He had learned over 7 years not to ask Eleanor Hayes Whitmore to explain herself when she spoke with that particular quality of certainty. He had learned that she was always in every meaningful sense ahead of the question. "I'll tell Victoria," he said. "Thank you, Thomas." She hung up the phone. She looked back out the window. A small, composed, entirely private smile crossed her face. Not the smile of a woman planning revenge, the smile of a woman who had been patient for a very long time and who could feel in her bones that the waiting was almost over. The week before the gala, Olivia Parker bought a dress. She had agonized over it for 3 weeks, had in fact made 2 separate trips to Fifth Avenue, consulted with a stylist that Michael had paid for, without being told exactly what the money was for, and spent a number of late-night hours scrolling through images of charity galas and red carpets, and women who looked the way she wanted to look on Saturday night. The dress was red, deep, saturated, unmistakable red. It had a silhouette that she knew with the certainty of someone who had thought about very little else for 3 weeks would stop conversation in a room. She tried it on in her apartment on Thursday evening and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She was 27 years old, and she had grown up without money, without connections, without any of the advantages that the people she was about to spend Saturday evening with had been born into as naturally as breathing. She had clawed her way into the professional world through talent and ambition, and a ferocious refusal to accept the ceilings that kept getting placed above her head. And now she was going to walk into the Waldorf Astoria on the arm of one of the most powerful men in New York. She told herself this was the beginning of something. She told herself she was finally, after years of working for it, arriving. She did not let herself think too carefully about what exactly she was arriving as. "You look incredible," Michael said when she sent him a photo. She believed him. She did not yet know what Saturday would cost her. On Friday evening, the night before the gala, Eleanor sat alone in the study with the 3 leather journals open on her desk and a glass of wine she was not really drinking. She had spent the past week reviewing everything, every document, every partnership agreement, every financial structure, every board decision, every name, every number, everything that had been built so quietly over 5 years that the people closest to her had no idea it existed. $120 million in committed capital. 47 young founders across 17 states who had received investment from Hayes Foundation when every traditional door had been closed to them. A board of advisors that included 3 former cabinet members, 2 Nobel laureates in economics, and a woman who had built and sold 2 companies by the time she was 35. Eleanor had done all of this. Not with Michael's money. She had been scrupulous about that, had used her own inheritance, her own financial acumen, her own network of relationships she had cultivated independently across 12 years of social events that everyone assumed she was attending only in support of her husband. She had not been attending in support of her husband. She had been attending in support of herself. She had been building. She picked up her pen and wrote one final note in the 3rd journal. Then she closed all 3 of them, stacked them neatly, and set them aside. She looked at the sapphire blue gown hanging on the back of the study door. Her assistant had brought it that afternoon, a designer she had worked with once before, a woman who understood that the most powerful statement a person could make was not volume, but clarity. The dress was not loud. It was not trying to compete with anything. It simply was what it was with absolute certainty. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment. Then she finished her wine, turned off the desk lamp, and went to bed. She slept easily. She had slept easily every night for the past 4 months, ever since she had made her decision. There is a particular kind of peace that comes to a person when they have stopped waiting for someone else to recognize their value and have simply decided to prove it. Eleanor had found that peace, and tomorrow night the rest of the world was about to find out that she had been living in it all along. The gala was 2 hours away. Michael was in his midtown office adjusting his tie, looking at himself in the mirror behind his private bathroom door. He thought about the room he was about to walk into, the cameras, the guests, the energy of 600 people who mattered in a space designed for exactly that kind of mutual recognition and display. He thought about Olivia. He told himself he deserved this. He told himself he had worked for 48 years to be the man who walked into that room, and that every choice he had made along the way was simply the cost of being that man, and that the cost was worth it, and that people who didn't understand that hadn't built what he had built. He straightened his tie. He picked up his phone. He texted Olivia, "Car is here in 20 minutes. You ready?" Her reply came in 11 seconds. "Born ready." Michael smiled. He put on his jacket. He walked out of his office without looking back. Down in Westchester, at a house that was emptier than it had been in 12 years, a limousine arrived at 8:15. The driver got out and opened the door. Eleanor Hayes Whitmore walked out of the house in the sapphire blue gown and the quiet, complete confidence of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone, but had decided to prove it anyway, just so there would be no remaining ambiguity. She got into the car. The car moved toward the city. She did not check her phone. She did not review notes. She did not rehearse what she was going to say. She looked out the window at the lights of New York spreading ahead of her, and she felt more than anything else, not triumphant, not vindicated, not angry. She felt free. That was the only word for it. Free. And in the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria, at that same moment, Michael Whitmore was smiling for a photographer, one hand resting on the small of Olivia Parker's back, his name being spoken by people he needed to impress the full architecture of the evening exactly as he had planned it. I thought he was the most powerful person in the building. He had no idea his wife was 10 minutes away. He had no idea that in 2 hours, nothing in his life would look the way it looked right now. He had no idea that the woman he had asked to go to the Hamptons was about to walk into the room he believed he controlled, and that the room would never be his again in quite the same way. He straightened his cufflinks. He smiled at Olivia. He said, "This is going to be a night to remember." And somewhere across the city in the back of a limousine that was moving steadily toward everything he thought he owned. Eleanor Hayes. Whitmore thought the exact same thing. The limousine moved through Manhattan like it had somewhere important to be, which it did, and Eleanor sat in the back of it with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the lights sliding past the window, and she was for the first time in a very long time completely at peace with what was about to happen. That was the thing about peace, real peace. Not the performed kind, not the kind you manufacture to keep a household functioning or a marriage from igniting, but the genuine article. It didn't feel triumphant. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like putting down something very heavy that you had been carrying for so long you had forgotten it wasn't part of your body. Eleanor had been carrying Michael Whitmore for 12 years, not in the way people carried difficult things reluctantly. She had loved him genuinely and specifically in the early years. She had loved the hunger in him, the relentless forward motion, the way he walked into a room and immediately understood its power dynamics and found his place at the top of them. She had found that attractive once. She had found it worth building a life around. But somewhere between year 4 and year 7, she had started to notice something. Michael had stopped seeing her. Not in the dramatic way of a sudden absence. In the slow, erosive way of a man who gets so used to something being there that he stops registering it as a choice anyone made. Like a painting on a wall you walk past every day until one morning you couldn't describe it if someone asked. Eleanor had become that painting, useful for the aesthetic, invisible as a presence, and the wrist. She touched it now briefly in the back of the car. The faint pressure where his hand had closed around it that morning, the grip that had said everything he hadn't said out loud in months. That was the moment she had known with absolute finality that the last thread of what they had been to each other had gone. She was not going to cry about it. She had already done that alone in the Hamptons house 8 months ago, one weekend when Michael had told her he was going to a conference in Chicago. She had driven out alone, sat on the porch with a glass of wine she hadn't really wanted, and let herself feel all of it. The grief, the anger, the bone-deep exhaustion of being consistently and completely unseen by the person who was supposed to know you best. She had cried for about 2 hours. Then she had made dinner, gone to bed, and woken up the next morning with the particular clarity that only comes after you've let yourself be completely honest about something. She had stopped waiting for Michael to see her. She had decided instead to be seen. The limousine pulled up to the Waldorf Astoria at 8:47. Eleanor did not rush. She waited for the driver to open her door. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. She stood for exactly 1 moment outside the entrance in the cool October air, and she took one breath slow and full, the way her mother had taught her when she was 12 years old and terrified before a piano recital. "You are not nervous," her mother had said. "You are ready. Those feel the same in your body. Choose which one you call it." Eleanor called it ready. Then she walked through the doors of the Waldorf Astoria and into the most important evening of her life. The lobby was already at full energy. 600 people in the particular state of elegant agitation that charity galas produce the air of people who care very much about being seen to care, which is not the same as actually caring, but produces a similar surface effect. Diamonds and champagne, and the particular low roar of money talking to money. Eleanor moved through it without hesitation, because she had moved through rooms exactly like this one for 12 years, and she knew their grammar by heart. What she did not know, not precisely, was where in this room Michael was standing. She found out 30 seconds later. She heard his laugh first. That particular laugh he had, the one that was 11% genuine amusement and 89% performance calibrated over decades for maximum social effect. She knew that laugh the way you know the sound of a car engine you've listened to for years, not consciously but in your body, a recognition below the level of thought. She turned slightly, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough. And there he was, Michael Whitmore in his best dark suit, with his silver cufflinks that she had given him for their 10th anniversary, holding a glass of champagne, standing with a group of 4 people she recognized: Robert Haynes from Haynes & Partner, the congressman's wife, whose name she could never remember, and someone from the media side of finance, whose face she placed without being able to attach a name. And next to Michael, her hand resting in the curve of his arm, with the practiced naturalness of someone who had rehearsed it, was a young woman in a red dress. Olivia Parker. Eleanor had seen photographs. Thomas had, with his characteristic understatement, emailed her a single image without comment 4 months ago, and Eleanor had looked at it for about 30 seconds, and then archived it in a folder she labeled with dry precision reference. The woman in the photographs and the woman across the lobby were the same person, which Eleanor had of course expected. What she had not quite expected was the expression on Olivia's face. Not the confidence she'd anticipated, not the calculated charm of a woman who knew what she was doing. What Eleanor saw was something younger and more genuine than that something that looked, if she was honest, like hope. Like a girl from somewhere without much money who had gotten herself into a room full of everything she'd ever wanted and was trying very hard not to show how much it mattered. Eleanor felt something unexpected move through her. Not sympathy exactly, recognition. She remembered being 27. She remembered wanting things badly enough to make choices she wasn't fully proud of. She let the feeling pass. She had a different evening ahead of her. She turned away from Michael's corner of the room and walked toward the table where Victoria Collins was waiting. Victoria Collins was 71 years old and had run the Hope Future Foundation for 19 of them. She was small, white-haired, and possessed of a quality that Eleanor had always privately admired. She did not care in any detectable way what anyone thought of her, which in a room like this one made her the most powerful person in it. "Eleanor," Victoria took both her hands, "you look extraordinary. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. There's a difference." Victoria squeezed her hands once and released them. "How are you feeling?" "Like myself," Eleanor said. Victoria smiled. "Good, that's exactly what tonight needs." They sat together for a few minutes going over the evening sequence when Eleanor would be introduced, what Victoria would say in the introduction, the brief remarks Eleanor had prepared. It was businesslike and warm in the way that conversations between women who respect each other tend to be efficient without being cold, direct without being hard. "There's one thing I want to ask you," Victoria said at the end. "Ask it. Your husband is here tonight." "I assumed he would be." "With a guest." A brief pause. "Yes." Victoria looked at her steadily. "Does that change anything for you?" Eleanor thought about it, not because she was uncertain of the answer, but because she believed in giving questions the respect of actual consideration before answering them. "No," she said. "If anything, it clarifies things." Victoria nodded once, the nod of a woman who understood exactly what that meant and had the wisdom to leave it exactly there. "Good," she said again. "We go on at 9:30. That gave Eleanor 40 minutes. She spent 20 of them working the room. This was something she was so practiced at that it barely required conscious effort. A conversation here, a handshake there. The particular art of making each person feel like the most important person she'd spoken to all evening. She spoke to James Whitfield from the SEC, who had been trying to arrange a meeting with her for 3 months and was openly delighted to run into her here. She spoke to Dr. Amara Osei, one of the Hayes Foundation's earliest board members, who had flown in from Atlanta and embraced her with the warmth of someone who knew exactly what tonight represented. She spoke to a journalist from the Financial Times who was covering the gala and who, upon learning who she was, got a particular gleam of professional recognition in her eyes that Eleanor noted with satisfaction. She did not look at Michael's corner of the room. She didn't need to. She could feel with the particular sensitivity of someone who has spent 12 years reading the social temperature of rooms the exact moment that Michael became aware of her presence. It happened at 9:04, according to the clock on the far wall. She was talking to James Whitfield, laughing at something he'd said, And across the room she heard the laugh stop. Michael's laugh, that particular social instrument, and in the silence that replaced it, she felt without looking the exact quality of his attention, snapping toward her like a compass needle finding north. She kept talking to James Whitfield. She heard a few seconds later the sound of hurried movement through the crowd. Not running. Michael would never run, but the kind of accelerated walking that a man does when he is trying to cross a room quickly without appearing to be in a hurry. She said something pleasant to James, excused herself with a smile, and turned. Michael was 6 feet away. He had left Olivia somewhere behind him. Eleanor could see the woman in the red dress standing exactly where Michael had been standing, her expression caught between confusion and a careful performance of calm tracking Michael's movement across the room with eyes that were working very hard to look unconcerned. Eleanor watched Michael close the last 6 feet between them. His face was doing several things at once. There was the shock which he was controlling, but not entirely successfully. She could see it in the slight tension around his eyes, the way his jaw had set a fraction too tight. There was something that might have been calculation, the instinctive positioning of a man who has been surprised and is already trying to figure out how to frame it. And underneath both of those, something she had not expected. Shame. Raw, real, genuine shame. That surprised her. Not because she had thought he was incapable of it. She had known him for 15 years. She understood exactly what he was capable of, but because she had not expected to see it this clearly, this immediately with so little of the usual architecture of self-justification in place. It was like looking at him without his suit on, something involuntary and exposing. "Eleanor." His voice was quiet, careful. "Michael," she said. "What are you? You thought I'd be in the Hamptons," she said pleasantly. He looked at her, his mouth opened and closed with the precise expression of a man whose entire script for the evening has just been taken away from him. "I was invited," Eleanor said. "I accepted. It seemed like the right thing to do." "Invited?" He stopped. Something shifted behind his eyes. "For what?" She looked at him calmly. "You'll find out." She excused herself with a smile that was not unkind, turned and walked back toward Victoria Collins. Behind her, she heard nothing. Not a word, not a step, not the sound of him following. Just the ambient roar of 600 conversations and the specific quality of a man standing very still in the middle of all of it. She did not look back. Across the room at 911, Olivia Parker touched Michael's arm and said quietly, urgently, "Michael, who was that?" He didn't answer immediately. "Michael, my wife," he said. The words came out flat, factual, like he was reading something off a document he didn't entirely understand. Olivia went very still. "Your wife," she repeated. "Yes." "Your wife is here." A pause. "At the gala." "Yes." Olivia looked across the room toward the woman in the sapphire blue dress, who was now deep in conversation with Victoria Collins, laughing about something completely at ease, looking like she owned the air in whatever part of the room she occupied. Olivia had imagined Michael's wife in a number of ways over 14 months. She had imagined someone cold or brittle, or in some way diminished someone whose inadequacy had created the space that Olivia occupied. She had not imagined this. She had not imagined a woman who walked into a room and made it smaller for everyone else, not through aggression or performance, but through a kind of absolute unhurried authority that Olivia had no word for. "Why is she here?" Olivia said. "I don't know," Michael said, which was the first completely honest thing he had said all evening. He stood there in his expensive suit with his expensive champagne, and he watched his wife across the ballroom, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately account for, he looked at Eleanor Hayes Whitmore and saw her. Not the backdrop, not the social asset, not the well-maintained presence in his well-maintained life. Her. The specific, actual person he had been married to for 12 years and had somehow, with extraordinary efficiency, managed not to see. He didn't like what he understood in that moment. He liked it even less at 9:30 when the lights in the ballroom came down. Victoria Collins stepped onto the stage. The room quieted with the particular speed of 600 people who know how to read a room. Victoria stood at this podium and looked out over the audience with the calm authority of someone who has nothing to sell and everything to give. And she said, 12 years ago, I was sitting in a conference room on the 44th floor of a building in Midtown, trying to explain to a group of men in very good suits why investing in young founders from communities those men had never visited was not a charity project. It was, I told them, the smartest investment anyone in that room could make. A ripple of polite recognition through the crowd. They nodded, Victoria said. They thanked me for my time. They invested in a different fund. Quiet laughter. What they didn't know, what I didn't know at the time, was that sitting in a different conference room in a different building on a different day was a woman who was having almost exactly the same conversation and getting almost exactly the same response. Victoria paused. And unlike me, she didn't wait for the room to change its mind. She decided to change the room itself. The ballroom was completely silent now. Michael Whitmore, standing at the edge of it, felt something cold move through him. The Hope Future Foundation's Maker of Hope Award exists to recognize people who don't wait for permission, Victoria said. People who look at a system that isn't working and build something better alongside it quietly, consistently, with the kind of patience that most of us mistake for passivity. Michael's champagne glass was very still in his hand. This year's recipient has over the past 5 years committed $120 million to support 47 young founders across 17 states. She has done this without a press release, without a profile in a business magazine, without a single announcement. She has simply done it because it needed to be done, and because she could, and because she understood something that a lot of very powerful people in this room have not yet figured out. Victoria looked up from her notes. That the most transformative things are often built by people everyone has decided not to watch. She smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this year's Maker of Hope, Eleanor Hayes Whitmore. The room erupted. Not polite applause. Not the performative clapping of 600 people following a social cue. Actual full rising applause, the kind that happens when a room full of people learns something that genuinely surprises them and finds that they are glad to have learned it. And through the crowd, through the center of it, walking with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never needed a crowd's approval and is only here because she chose to be, came Eleanor, in the sapphire blue dress, with her chin up, with her hands at her sides, with the expression of a woman who is not arriving, who has in every way that matters already been here. Michael Whitmore watched her walk to that stage and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, fear. Not the business kind, not the strategic, manageable fear of a deal going sideways or a market turning. Something older and more fundamental than that. The fear of a man who has built his entire understanding of his own life on a set of assumptions that are at this exact moment being dismantled in front of 600 of the most important people he knows. Beside him, Olivia had gone very still. She was watching Eleanor take the award from Victoria Collins, and the expression on her face was something Michael had never seen there before. Not the admiration she usually turned on him, not the calculation she occasionally let slip through, but something naked and honest and young. It was awe. "She's your wife," Olivia said. Not a question this time. Something else. "Yes," Michael said. "She built a $120 million fund. Apparently. While married to you." He said nothing. Olivia turned and looked at him then, and the expression that crossed her face in that moment, the slow arriving comprehension of something she had been choosing not to understand, was perhaps the most honest thing she had shown him in 14 months. "She knew," Olivia said, "about us, didn't she?" Michael's jaw tightened. Olivia laughed, a short, quiet, completely mirthless sound. "And she still did all of this," she said. "She knew about us, and she just kept building." On the stage, Eleanor stepped to the microphone. The room went quiet again instantly, the way rooms go quiet for people who have earned silence rather than simply demanded it. Eleanor looked out over the audience. She did not look for Michael. That was the thing he would remember longest in the months and years that followed. Not what she said, not the applause, not the award, not the public architecture of his humiliation. The thing that would stay with him, that would wake him up at 2 a.m. with its particular and deserved weight, was that she didn't look for him. She looked at everyone else. She looked at the room as if it were full of people who mattered, and she was there for them, and he was simply one more member of an audience she had no special need of. She said, "I want to talk about patience." Her voice was steady and warm and carried to every corner of the room with the ease of someone who has always known exactly what she wanted to say and has simply been waiting for the right moment to say it. Not the passive kind, she continued. Not the patience of someone waiting for permission. I mean the active kind. The patience of someone who is building something quietly and consistently, while everyone around her has decided she isn't building anything at all. A ripple through the crowd. Something recognizing something. I've spent a long time in rooms full of extraordinary people, Eleanor said, being seen as the woman standing next to someone extraordinary. And I want to say something to every woman in this room who has ever been that person. She paused. The room doesn't define you. The person you're standing next to doesn't define you. What defines you is what you do in the margins of the life everyone else has decided you're living. The applause started before she finished the sentence. It built and built, and it was the kind of applause that isn't really about the person on the stage, but about something the audience needed to hear and is grateful with a fierceness that surprised some of them to have finally heard. Michael Whitmore stood in the middle of it. He did not applaud, not because he was making a choice, but because his hands were not working the way they normally worked, and his chest felt like something had been tightened inside it, and he was engaged in the very difficult task of being a man who has just understood something he should have understood years ago, and is experiencing for the first time in a very long time the full and unmediated weight of being wrong. Olivia beside him was crying, quietly, carefully trying not to be seen doing it, but crying nonetheless. He looked at her. He had the impulse to say something to comfort her, to manage the situation, to do something that would restore some version of the control he had walked into this building believing he possessed. But the impulse died before it reached language because he looked at Olivia Parker crying at his side, and he understood with a clarity he had not asked for and could not now return that he had been using this young woman. Not consciously, not cruelly, not in the way of a villain, which would have been in some way easier, in the way of a man who needed something and took it without fully accounting for the cost. Olivia was 27 years old, and she was crying at a charity gala because she had walked into a situation she had not fully understood, and Michael had known more than she had and had let her walk in anyway. That was not something he could put in a drawer and close. On the stage, Eleanor finished her remarks. She thanked Victoria. She thanked the foundation. She said the names of several of the 47 founders her fund had supported, said them deliberately and carefully, as if each name mattered, which they did, and the room listened with the attentiveness of people who are recalibrating their sense of what is important. She stepped back from the microphone. The applause rose again. And in that moment, James Whitfield appeared at Michael's elbow. James Whitfield, who had been talking to Eleanor 20 minutes ago with the open warmth of someone who had been trying to get a meeting with her for 3 months. "Remarkable woman," James said. Michael looked at him. "Your wife," James clarified in case there was any ambiguity. "I've been trying to get on her calendar for months. Didn't realize the connection until tonight." He shook his head with the expression of professional admiration. "The Hayes Foundation is extraordinary. What she's built quietly without any of the usual machinery, it's genuinely one of the most impressive things I've seen in this industry in years." Michael said nothing. "You must be incredibly proud," James said. The word landed like the stone in still water. Proud. Michael thought about the morning, the kitchen, his hand on her wrist, the grip that had said everything about what he thought of her without a single word. Proud. "Yes," he said, because it was the only word available. James nodded, pleasantly, clapped him once on the shoulder, and moved away into the crowd. Beside Michael, Olivia had composed herself. She looked at him with an expression that was, he recognized the end of something. "I think," she said carefully, "I'm going to call a car." He looked at her. "Olivia, don't," she said, not angry, just quiet. "Just don't." She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, began typing. "This was a mistake," she said. "Not just tonight. I think all of it was a mistake." She looked up from the phone. "I think I was so busy wanting to be in this world that I didn't ask myself what I was doing to get here." Michael said nothing. "She knew about us," Olivia said, "and she built a $120 million fund instead of fighting me for you." She put her phone back in her bag. "What does that tell you about how she sees you?" Olivia said. "And what does it tell you about how she sees herself?" She didn't wait for an answer. She walked away through the crowd, the red dress catching the light, and the last Michael saw of her that evening was the back of her head moving toward the exit, with the quiet, definitive movement of someone who has made a decision and is done renegotiating it. Michael stood alone, 600 people around him, and he stood alone in a room that his wife had just transformed, holding a champagne glass he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Across the ballroom, Eleanor was surrounded by people. Not the polite, obligatory circle of a gala attendee, but the genuine, pressing alive circle of people who want to be near someone, because being near them makes them feel like the world is larger than they thought. Thomas Reyes was there, beaming with the satisfaction of a man who has watched someone he believed in get exactly what they deserved. Dr. Osei was there, her hand on Eleanor's arm. The journalist from the Financial Times was there, asking questions that Eleanor was answering with calm precision. Michael watched her. He watched her laugh. He watched her listen. He watched her turn toward each person as if they were the only person in the room, which was... He realized something she had always done, something he had always benefited from, something he had never once acknowledged as the extraordinary skill it was. He had thought she wasn't ambitious. He had thought she wasn't watching. He had thought she wasn't building anything. He had been wrong about every single thing. He started walking toward her. He wasn't sure what he was going to say. He wasn't sure there was anything to say that would be adequate to the size of what he was carrying right now. But he walked toward her anyway, because he was a man who had never in his life walked away from a hard thing, and he was not going to start tonight, regardless of whether he deserved to be walking toward her or not. He was about 10 feet away when Eleanor looked up. She saw him. Her expression did not change. That was the thing. After everything, the evening, the stage, the applause, the award, the $120 million, the 47 founders, the 5 years of quiet and determined and completely invisible building. Her expression when she looked at him did not change. No triumph, no anger, no ice, just Eleanor. Looking at him the way she had always looked at him, with the steady, clear-eyed attention of a woman who sees everything and has long since decided what to do with what she sees. She said something to Thomas Reyes, touched his arm, and took 3 steps toward Michael, meeting him halfway, because she had always been in every way that counted the one willing to do that. They stood facing each other in the middle of the ballroom. "Eleanor," he said. "Michael," she said. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of this. The foundation, the award." "I know you didn't," she said. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Because," she said, "you never asked." The 3 words sat between them, perfectly simple and completely devastating. He wanted to argue with them. He opened his mouth to find the argument and found nothing there, because the 3 words were in every way he could examine them completely and irreversibly true. He had never asked, in 12 years. In 12 years of dinner parties she had organized, and conversations she had managed, and evenings she had navigated, and mornings she had made function. He had never once sat across from Eleanor Hayes Whitmore and genuinely asked her with the full attention of a man who actually wants to know the answer. "What are you building?" "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me several," she said, "but not tonight." She looked at him one more moment. Something in her eyes that was not warmth exactly, but was not coldness either. Something more like the particular quality of a person who has fully decided and is at peace with the decision. "Tonight," Eleanor said, "belongs to something larger than either of us." She turned back toward the people waiting for her. And Michael Whitmore stood alone in the center of the room he had believed he controlled. In the middle of the evening he had planned as a showcase for his power, and understood with the slow and total comprehension of a man receiving a truth. He cannot return that the most extraordinary person in the building had been standing next to him for 12 years, and he had looked straight through her, every single day. The car that took Michael Whitmore home that night was his own, the same black car, the same driver he had used for 11 years, a man named Gerald, who had the professional discretion of someone who had seen everything and commented on none of it. Michael sat in the back and looked out the window and said nothing, for the entire 40-minute ride to Westchester and Gerald, with the wisdom of a man who understood when silence was the only appropriate response to a situation, said nothing either. Michael had left the gala at 11:15. Eleanor had still been there when he left. He had watched her for another hour after their conversation in the middle of the ballroom, watched her from a distance, with the particular helplessness of a man who has lost the ability to cross a room with any confidence about what he will find when he gets to the other side. He had watched her talk to the Financial Times journalist, watched her exchange cards with 3 people he recognized as significant, and 2 he didn't, watched her sit down at a corner table with Victoria Collins and Dr. Osei and lean forward in that way she had that way of giving her full attention that he had once thought was simply politeness, and now understood was something much more intentional than that. She had not looked at him again. Not once in that entire hour, and that specific, sustained, completely non-hostile absence of attention had been more painful than anything she could have said or done or thrown in his direction. He walked through the front door of the Westchester house at 12:04 in the morning and stood in the front hall for a moment in the dark, and the house felt different. He couldn't have said precisely how. The furniture was in the same places. The art was the same. The particular quality of silence that large, expensive houses have in the middle of the night was exactly as it had always been. But it felt different. It felt like a house that had been built by someone he didn't know as well as he thought he did. He loosened his tie. He walked to his study. He poured 2 fingers of the scotch that Eleanor had selected for him 3 Christmases ago from a distillery she had researched because she knew he would appreciate the specific profile of it, and he sat down in the chair behind his desk and he began for the first time in a very long time to think. Not the strategic kind of thinking, not the board meeting deal structure risk assessment kind of thinking that had made him wealthy and was the only kind of thinking he was usually willing to give much of his time to. The other kind. The kind that doesn't have a framework or a model or a projected outcome. The kind that just sits with a thing and tries to understand it. $120 million, 47 founders, 5 years. While they were living in this house, while she was organizing his dinner parties and attending his social obligations and standing beside him at events exactly like the one he had just left and making him look good, making him look complete, making him look like a man who had everything she had been building something of her own, with a discipline and a patience and a scope that, if he was being honest, exceeded anything he had attempted in the last 5 years of his own career. And he had not known. He had not known because he had not asked. Because he had not asked because some part of him, some part, he was not proud of some part, he was only now being forced to look at directly, had not believed there was anything there worth asking about. He thought about the morning, the kitchen, her wrist. He put the scotch glass down on the desk and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed. He had grabbed his wife's wrist and told her to stay home. He had touched her like she was furniture he was rearranging. And she had looked at him with those clear, steady eyes and said, "Okay, Michael," and gone to her meeting and spent the rest of the week preparing to walk into the Waldorf Astoria as the most respected person in the room. He sat in that chair until 2 in the morning. Then he went to bed, and he did not sleep. Eleanor came home at 1:15. He heard the car. He heard the front door. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, measured and unhurried, the walk of someone who is not trying to be quiet, but is naturally so. He heard her pause outside the bedroom door. He lay in the dark and waited. She did not come in. After a moment, her footsteps continued down the hall to the guest suite, where she had apparently already decided she would be sleeping. Michael stared at the ceiling. "I thought this is what the end of something feels like. Not a fight, not a confrontation, not any of the dramatic machinery of collapse, just footsteps going down a hall and a door closing quietly, and the particular silence of a house in which 2 people are awake and choosing not to speak to each other. He thought he had known what the end of his marriage would look like if it ever came. He had never imagined it looking like this. By 9 the next morning, the Financial Times had run a piece online. The headline was clean and factual and hit the financial world like a hammer. Eleanor Hayes Whitmore, the $100 million secret nobody saw coming. The subheading read, "Whitmore Capital founder's wife revealed as architect of one of the year's most significant impact investment vehicles." Thomas Reyes read it at his kitchen table in Connecticut, sipped his coffee, and allowed himself a small smile. Dr. Amara Osei read it on her phone on the flight back to Atlanta and forwarded it to 11 people before the plane left the gate. The journalist from the Financial Times, whose name was Sarah Chen, had apparently written the piece in 3 hours after leaving the gala and filed it at 1 in the morning, which explained why it had the particular quality of energy that journalism only has when the writer is genuinely excited about something rather than simply meeting a deadline. The piece was comprehensive. It covered the Hayes Foundation's structure, its investment thesis, its founding partners, the 47 companies it had backed, the outcomes of those investments, several of which were Sarah Chen noted with clear professional admiration, already generating returns that outperformed the standard venture benchmarks. It described Eleanor's background, her family's financial history, her education, her professional trajectory before her marriage, a trajectory that the piece noted had been largely invisible to anyone who had only known her as Michael Whitmore's wife. That phrase, largely invisible to anyone who had only known her as Michael Whitmore's wife, it appeared in the fourth paragraph, and it was in the polite but exacting language of good financial journalism, an indictment. By 10:30 in the morning, Michael's phone had received 47 calls and messages. He looked at them. He did not answer most of them. He answered 3, his lawyer, his CFO, and his oldest friend, Daniel Park, who had known him since Columbia and was one of perhaps 5 people in the world whose calls Michael never sent to voicemail. "I saw the Times piece," Daniel said without preamble. "I imagine everyone did," Michael said. "How are you?" "Oh, fine." Michael. "I'm not fine," Michael said, "but I will be." A pause. "Did you know?" Daniel asked. "About the foundation?" "No." Another pause, longer this time. "She built a $120 million fund," Daniel said, "and you didn't know." "No." "While you were—" Daniel stopped. He had the loyalty of a man who didn't say the thing you both knew he was thinking when you were already clearly having the worst morning of your professional life. "Yes," Michael said, "while I was." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "She was always the smartest person in the room, Michael. I told you that at your wedding." "I remember." "You laughed." "I know." "Did you think I was joking?" Michael looked out the window at the garden Eleanor had designed, at the particular arrangement of everything that her choices had produced. "No," he said. "I think I knew you weren't. I just couldn't afford to believe it." After he hung up with Daniel, he sat with that sentence for a while. He couldn't afford to believe it. Because if he had believed it, if he had allowed himself to fully see Eleanor for what she was, who she was, the specific and extraordinary scope of her, then he would have had to look at himself differently. He would have had to ask harder questions about what his success actually rested on. He would have had to acknowledge that the life he moved through with such confident ownership was in significant ways something she had built alongside him, and sometimes instead of him, and always in spite of him being too busy looking elsewhere to notice. I was not a man who liked hard questions. He was a man who had spent 48 years getting very good at not needing to ask them. At 11:15, Eleanor came downstairs. Michael was in the kitchen. He had made coffee, actually made it himself, which he almost never did, which felt in this moment like the smallest possible gesture, and therefore exactly the right one to start with. Eleanor walked in. She was dressed, but simply no armor in her clothing this morning, just a quiet competence. She stopped when she saw him at the coffee maker. She did not say good morning. He turned and held out a mug. She looked at it for a moment, then she took it. She sat at the kitchen island. He sat across from her. Between them was the counter and the coffee and 12 years, and everything that had happened the night before, which was too large to address directly and too present to pretend wasn't there. "The Times piece," he said. "I saw it. Sarah Chen is thorough." "She is," Eleanor agreed. "I spoke with her for 40 minutes last night, after you left." After you left. Not an accusation, just a fact delivered with the precision of someone who does not need to editorialize about the facts because the facts are sufficient. "Eleanor," he said. "Michael, I need to say something." She wrapped both hands around the mug and waited with the patience of a woman who has been waiting for a very long time and is no longer in any hurry. "I treated you," he started. Then he stopped. The sentence he had begun required him to finish it honestly, and finishing it honestly required him to look at something he had been declining to look at for years, and looking at it directly felt in this quiet kitchen, like something that might genuinely break something inside him. He started again. "I treated you as if you were a supporting character in my life, and I did it so consistently for so long that I stopped seeing it as a choice. I thought it was just the way things were." Eleanor said nothing. "That is not a defense," he said. "I'm not explaining. I'm acknowledging." She looked at him, that steady, clear-eyed look. "I know the difference," she said. "The thing at your wrist," he said. "Yesterday morning." Something moved behind her eyes, a brief flicker of something she contained immediately. You don't need to, she started. I do, he said. I grabbed you like you were something I owned, and I am deeply ashamed of that. Not because it was witnessed, because I did it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside a bird. Traffic on the road at the edge of the property. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning that was not in any way ordinary. Eleanor set her mug down. I know you are, she said quietly. I can see that. Does it matter? He asked, and he meant it genuinely, not as a plea, not as a bid for absolution, but as an actual question from a man who has lost his bearings and is trying for perhaps the first time to find them honestly. Eleanor thought about the question, the way she thought about all questions, with genuine attention, with the respect of not reaching for a quick answer when a real one was available. It would have mattered, she said carefully, if it had come before last night. If you had arrived at it on your own, without the Waldorf and the award and the Times piece. She looked at him. Right now, I don't know what it is, whether it's genuine or whether it's the particular shame of a man who has been seen doing something he preferred to do in private. He took that. He let it land. That's fair, he said. I know it is, she said. She picked up her mug again. Michael, she said, I want you to understand something. I didn't build the foundation because of you. I didn't build it to prove anything to you or to anyone else. I built it because I looked at the world and saw something that needed to be built, and I had the ability to build it. She paused. You were not the reason. But the way you saw me, the way this marriage trained me to make myself small and invisible, that was something I had to work against every single day. Every meeting I took in the margins of a life that was supposed to be entirely about you. Every decision I made with the knowledge that if you found out what I was doing, you would probably think it was, she paused, adorable. The word hit him like a cold hand. Adorable. Yes, he said quietly. I know, she said. Because that is exactly how you would have said it, with affection, with complete unconscious condescension. She was not angry, which was somehow worse than if she had been. She was simply accurate. You would have said something like, That's wonderful, Eleanor, a little fun for young entrepreneurs. I love that you have a project. And you would have meant it kindly. And that is almost the hardest part of all of this. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Because she was right. He knew with absolute certainty that she was right, that if she had shown him a version of the Hayes Foundation 2 years ago, he would have smiled and said something exactly like that, something warm and entirely belittling, and he would have felt good about himself for being supportive, and the condescension would have been so built into his posture toward her that he wouldn't have recognized it as condescension at all. I don't know how to fix this, he said. I know you don't, Eleanor said. I'm not sure it can be fixed. I'm not sure I want to try to fix it. She looked at him directly. I have been thinking about this for 4 months, Michael. Not impulsively, not in anger. I have been sitting with this very carefully the way I sit with every important decision, and I want you to hear what I've decided. He looked at her. I want a divorce, she said. The word sat in the kitchen like a stone. Eleanor, I'm not asking, she said. I'm telling you what I've decided. I'm telling you calmly and respectfully, because that is how I intend to conduct this process, and I want you to know that I am not your enemy, and I have no interest in destroying you. But I am done. She paused. I have been done for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Michael sat with that wing. He had enough of the lawyer's instinct in him to see the angles to understand that nothing was final until paperwork made it so, to believe that most positions were negotiable if you found the right frame. But he looked at Eleanor's face, at the settled, finished quality of it, the face of a woman who has already lived on the other side of this decision and found it livable, and he understood that some positions are not negotiable, not because the other person won't move, but because the other person has already left. She had already left. She was just doing him the courtesy of telling him in person. Okay, he said. She looked at him. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of recognition. Of the word, of what it cost him. Thank you, she said. I don't want, he started. I know. I want you to know. Michael. Her voice was gentle, genuinely gentle. I know. I have known you for 15 years. I know what you want to say, and I know that you mean it. And it changes some things, and not others. She looked at him steadily. It doesn't change what I've decided. He nodded. He looked down at the counter. I thought about 48 years of being a man who controlled rooms and narratives and outcomes, and he thought about how completely and specifically that had failed him in the most important room of his life, and he felt something that he could not name precisely, but that had the texture of grief. "Is there anything I can do?" he said. "That isn't, I mean, not to change anything, just to make this easier." Eleanor looked at him for a moment, and in that look was something that was not love exactly, not anymore, but was in the family of it, the particular regard of someone who has known you very deeply and has not lost even in the process of leaving the ability to see what is real in you. "Be honest," she said, "with the lawyers and with yourself and with whatever comes next. Don't try to manage the narrative, just be honest." He almost laughed. The word narrative, manage the narrative, his lifelong reflex coming out of her mouth in that context. "You know me too well," he said. "Yes," she said. "I always did." She stood, picked up her mug, and walked toward the hallway. "Eleanor," he said. She stopped. "The 47 founders," he said. "The ones you backed." She turned slightly. "I'd like to know about them," he said. I'm not asking for anything, I'd like to know." He looked at her. "If you're willing to tell me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's a woman in Nashville, 26 years old. She built a healthcare logistics platform for rural communities. She came to me with 17 rejections and no money, and a pitch deck that was the most clearly thought-through document I had seen in 10 years of sitting in investment meetings." A pause. "We gave her $2 million in seed capital 18 months ago. She's now processing claims for 40,000 patients." The number landed quietly and precisely. 40,000 patients, Michael repeated. "Yes," Eleanor said, and she walked out of the kitchen. He sat there for a long time with the cold coffee and the weight of the number and the particular and earned silence of a man who is beginning slowly, and not without pain, to understand the size of what he failed to see. By noon, Robert Haynes had called. Robert Haynes, who had been standing with Michael and Olivia the night before at the gala, and who had responded to Eleanor's appearance with the expression of a man recalculating something important, called at exactly 12:02. "I'm going to be direct," Robert said. He was always direct. Michael had always valued that about him. "There's talk among 3 of our mutual investment partners about the Hayes Foundation, specifically about the returns on their portfolio companies and the structure of their next fund round." Michael said nothing. "They're very interested," Robert said, "in Eleanor, in what she's built." "I imagine they are." "One of them, I won't name names, but you know who I'm talking about. The Singapore group asked me if there's any way to request a meeting." A pause. "With Eleanor." "Not with Michael. With Eleanor." "You'll need to ask her directly," Michael said. "I don't represent her interests." A beat of silence. "No," Robert said carefully. "I understand that." "She has her own team," Michael said. "Thomas Reyes has been managing her advisory. He can point you toward the right contact." "Thomas Reyes," Robert repeated. He knew the name. Everyone in private wealth management knew Thomas Reyes. "She's been working with Thomas." "For 7 years," Michael said. Another beat, longer. "Michael," Robert said slowly, "how much of what she built did you know about this? Any of it?" "No," Michael said. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who is digesting information that significantly changes the picture he had of another man. "The Singapore group isn't the only one," Robert said finally. "I want you to know that. There are at least 4 significant players in this space who are going to be reaching out to her in the next 72 hours. Tell them to use Thomas's office," Michael said. He hung up. He sat at his desk and thought about 4 significant players and the Singapore group and a woman in Nashville processing 40,000 patient claims, and he thought about Whitmore Capital and the deals he had closed and the narrative he had controlled for 2 decades, and for the first time in his career, he sat in his own office and felt like the smaller story in the room. It was not a comfortable feeling. He was beginning to understand an accurate one. At 2 in the afternoon, he drove to his lawyer's office. Jonathan Price had handled Michael Whitmore's legal affairs for 14 years. He was a man of vast professional experience and very little surprise, a lawyer's lawyer who had seen enough of human behavior to be genuinely difficult to shock. He was surprised today, not by the divorce. Divorces among people of Michael's wealth and complexity were a standard feature of Jonathan's practice and produced in him nothing more than the professional alertness of a man preparing for a complex negotiation. He was surprised by Michael, specifically by the version of Michael who sat across the desk from him that afternoon. Not the usual Michael, the one who came in with a position and a counterposition and a bottom line already calculated, but a quieter man, a man sitting with his hands on his knees and his shoulders carrying something visible. "She'll have her own representation," Jonathan said. "Of course. Do you have a sense of what she's going to ask for?" "I have a sense," Michael said, "that whatever she asks for will be reasonable. Eleanor is always reasonable." Jonathan looked at him over the top of his glasses. "You want to be fair," Jonathan said, not a question. "I want to be honest," Michael said. "She asked me to be honest. I would like to honor that, at minimum." Jonathan wrote something on his notepad. "At minimum," he said. "She built something extraordinary," Michael said, "independently, with her own resources and her own capital and her own connections. I don't want to complicate that. I don't want to attach myself to it legally when I had nothing to do with building it." Jonathan looked at him again. "That is an unusual position for someone in your situation," he said. "I'm aware," Michael said. "Most people." "I know what most people do," Michael said. "I've watched enough of them do it." He looked at his lawyer. "I don't want to be most people, not in this." Jonathan wrote something else on the notepad. "All right," he said. "We'll proceed on that basis." Michael left Jonathan's office at 3:15 and sat in the car for a while before telling Gerald to take him back to the office. He thought about Olivia. He had not spoken to her since the gala, had not texted, had not called, had not done any of the things that the 14 months of their relationship would have previously made automatic. Her message from this morning was still unread on his phone. He knew without reading it its general shape she would be clear, she would be definitive, she would not be cruel. She was not a cruel person. She was a young woman who had made choices she now understood differently, and she would move forward from them with the same energy she applied to everything. She would be fine. He hoped she would be fine. He opened the message. It said, "I've asked to be reassigned to a different account team. I think that's the right thing for both of us. I want you to know I don't hate you, but I also want you to know, really know, that what I saw last night changed something in me. Your wife is remarkable. You should have known that. I think you know it now." He read it twice. He typed, "You are right about all of it. I wish you well. I mean that." He sent it. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked out the window at the city that had always, for as long as he could remember, felt like something he had earned and owned and moved through with the confidence of rightful belonging. It still looked the same, but it felt subtly and irreversibly like a place where a different story was now being told. Not his story, or not only his story. A story in which he was a character of middling importance, and a woman in a sapphire blue dress had just become, without fanfare or announcement, or any of the machinery, he had always assumed power required one of the most consequential people in the room. He had always believed he understood how power worked. How was beginning to understand that he had only ever understood one kind, and Eleanor Hayes Whitmore quietly and patiently, and with extraordinary precision, had been building another kind entirely, right next to him, every single day. 3 days after the gala, the story had legs. Not the kind of legs that a publicist manufactures or a PR team engineers over weeks of careful placement. The organic kind. The kind that happens when something is true enough and surprising enough and human enough that people cannot stop passing it to each other, cannot stop saying, "Did you see this? And you have to read this." And I knew someone like her once, the kind of story that travels because it touches something real in the people who encounter it. By Wednesday morning, the Financial Times piece had been shared 43,000 times. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 other publications had run their own versions. Bloomberg, with a focus on the investment mechanics of the Hayes Foundation, the Wall Street Journal, with a broader profile of Eleanor's background and education, and a women's business journal called Meridian that ran a piece with the headline, "She was the backdrop, then she built the stage." That headline alone was shared 22,000 times in 6 hours. Eleanor read all of it from the desk in what had been the guest suite and was now effectively her room. She read it with the same careful attention she gave to everything, not looking for flattery, not flinching from criticism, just reading to understand what the world was making of what had happened and whether that understanding was accurate. Mostly it was accurate. The Meridian piece was the most accurate of all, which surprised her slightly because she had expected the financial press to be more precise and the lifestyle press to be more impressionistic. But the journalist who had written She Was the Backdrop, a woman named Priya Anand, who had apparently stayed up until 4 in the morning, pulling together 14 months of public records and foundation filings that nobody had previously bothered to connect, had produced something that made Eleanor sit very still for a long time after she finished reading it. Because Priya Anand had not written about triumph. She had written about cost. She had written about what it actually requires in terms of daily grinding, invisible discipline, to build something extraordinary in the margins of a life that everyone around you has decided is already fully defined. She had written about the particular exhaustion of operating at full capacity in a world that only sees you operating at 20%. She had written with a precision that felt almost uncomfortably close about the choice Eleanor had made, not the choice to build the foundation, but the earlier choice, the foundational choice, the choice to not be defeated by being underestimated. Eleanor put the laptop down. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Priya Anand's desk at Meridian. The journalist answered on the second ring with the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a specific call and trying not to seem like they've been waiting. "Ms. Anand," Eleanor said, "this is Eleanor Hayes." A beat of silence. "Ms. Hayes," Priya said, "thank you for calling." "I want to ask you something," Eleanor said, "and I want you to know I'm not calling to push back on anything you wrote. I'm calling because you got something right that I didn't expect anyone to get right, and I'd like to understand how." Another pause. Longer. The pause of a journalist recalibrating. "What did I get right?" Priya said carefully. "The cost," Eleanor said. "Most people are writing about the outcome. You wrote about the cost." The silence that followed had a different quality. Something in it that was not professional anymore. Something personal. "My mother," Priya said finally, "ran a small business for 20 years while raising 3 kids and managing my father's career. She was extraordinarily competent. Nobody except us ever knew how competent she was because the world only saw her in relation to everyone else she was supporting." A pause. "I think about her when I write about women like you." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about your mother's business," she said. And that was how at 10:47 on a Wednesday morning, Eleanor Hayes Whitmore began a conversation that would within 14 months result in Hayes Foundation providing seed capital to Priya Anand's mother's second business venture. But that was later. In this moment, it was just 2 women on the phone, one of them having seen something true about the other's life, and the other being grateful simply and genuinely to have been seen. By Thursday, Thomas Reyes's office had received 19 meeting requests. He called Eleanor at 9 in the morning to go over them, which had become their standing daily call since Tuesday. He read the list of names with the measured cadence of a man who had been in finance long enough to know what each name meant and was allowing Eleanor the space to respond to each one in her own order. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The Singapore group first." "I had the same instinct," Thomas said. "They've been the most patient." "Patient investors are worth talking to," Eleanor said. "Anyone who calls within 48 hours of a press event is reacting. Anyone who called before the press event was paying attention." "The Singapore group called before," Thomas said. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why they're first." She paused. "Who else called before?" Thomas checked his notes. 3 names. The Singapore group. A woman named Dr. Catherine Marsh from the Marsh family office in Chicago. And someone I want you to be careful about. "Tell me." "Richard Alcott." Eleanor was quiet. Richard Alcott was not a name that required explanation to anyone in the upper levels of American private finance. He was 67 years old, a man of such substantial old money influence that his interest in any investment vehicle was treated less as a business opportunity and more as a kind of consecration. He had backed 12 companies in the last 20 years. 8 of them had become household names. He had also, 18 months ago, in a conference in Aspen that Eleanor had attended with Michael, sat across a dinner table from Eleanor for 2 hours and directed every question to Michael, while Eleanor sat next to him with the invisible patience of someone who has learned that some rooms are not worth correcting, only enduring. "Richard Alcott called before the Times piece," Eleanor said. "At 6:17 Wednesday morning," Thomas confirmed, "before most people had read it." "Which means he knew before the piece ran." "Yes," Thomas said. "He has someone at the foundation board," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "That would be my guess," Thomas said. "Someone told him Tuesday evening. He made 1 call, left 1 message, and hasn't followed up." Eleanor thought about this. He's not reacting, she said. He's positioning. Yes. He sat across from me for 2 hours in Aspen, she said, and asked my husband to pass the salt without looking at me. I know, Thomas said. Schedule him last, Eleanor said. After everyone else, let him wait. She could hear the satisfaction in Thomas's brief silence before he said, Of course. There was a particular pleasure in that, not petty pleasure, not revenge dressed up as strategy, but the clean-earned pleasure of a woman who has spent years being invisible to a certain kind of man and is now for the first time in a position to make him wait his turn. She allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of it. Then she moved on. Michael called at 11. She let it ring twice before answering, not out of calculation, but because she was in the middle of a sentence in the email she was drafting, and she believed in finishing sentences. Eleanor, he said. Michael. I heard from Robert Haynes this morning. He said Thomas's office has been that there are a number of groups reaching out. Yes, she said. I wanted to say I want you to know that I haven't spoken to any of them about you, about the foundation. I told Robert to go through Thomas, and I've told everyone else the same. She had already known this because Thomas would have told her if anyone had attempted to use Michael as an access point. But she recognized what Michael was doing, not seeking credit for staying out of her way, but making sure she knew he understood that staying out of her way was the right thing to do. Thank you, she said. The lawyers, he started. Jonathan called Patricia yesterday, she said. Patricia Voss was the attorney she had retained quietly 3 months ago, when she had understood that the end of the marriage was no longer a question of whether, but of when. They're scheduling the first conversation for Monday. Patricia Voss, Michael said. He knew the name. Everyone in New York legal circles knew the name. She's very good. Yes, Eleanor said. She is. A pause. I'm not going to fight you, he said. I want you to know that. I told Jonathan whatever you ask for, that's reasonable, we don't fight. I know, she said. Jonathan told Patricia the same thing. Does it help to know that... Eleanor thought about the question with the same genuine attention she gave all of them. It helps me know that you're being honest, she said, which is what I asked you to be. So yes, it helps. A silence between them. Not uncomfortable. Something sadder than uncomfortable. The woman in Nashville, Michael said. Yes. I looked her up, he said. Her company, the healthcare logistics platform. Another pause. She's been written up in 3 medical journals. The efficiency gains she's producing in rural emergency care, Eleanor, it's extraordinary. Her name is Destiny Williams, Eleanor said. I know, Michael said. I read everything I could find. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Michael Whitmore, who had never in 12 years asked her about her own projects, staying up late enough to read 3 medical journal articles about a 26-year-old woman in Nashville who Eleanor had believed in before anyone else had. It was too late. She knew it was too late, but it was not nothing. She's speaking at the Hayes Foundation Symposium in January, Eleanor said. She's the keynote. She should be, Michael said quietly. They stayed on the phone for another moment without speaking. 2 people who had known each other for 15 years, sitting in the ruins of what they had been to each other, finding in the wreckage a few things that were still real. Take care of yourself, Eleanor said finally. You too, he said. She hung up. She sat for a moment. Then she opened her email and finished the sentence she had been writing when the phone rang. The meeting with the Singapore group happened Friday morning. They sent 2 principals, a man named Jin Ho Park and a woman named Mei Lin, both in their early 50s, both possessed of the particular quality of stillness that Eleanor associated with people who have been in serious money long enough to stop being impressed by it and start being interested only in what it can actually build. They sat across from Eleanor in the Hayes Foundation's conference room, a modest space in a midtown building that nobody had heard of, because Eleanor had specifically chosen a location that communicated nothing about scale or ambition, that let the work speak without the theater, and they talked for 2 hours. Not about returns, not primarily. They talked about the 47 founders, about the selection criteria Eleanor had developed, which were unusual and specific, and bore almost no resemblance to any standard venture framework currently in use. They talked about what Eleanor called the competence gap, the space between what someone can actually do and what the traditional funding system is able to see them doing, and how the Hayes Foundation had designed its evaluation process specifically to see into that gap. Jin-Ho Park took notes by hand in a small leather notebook, which Eleanor noticed and appreciated. Maylin asked 7 questions in 2 hours. Every single one of them was the right question, in the right order, asked in the right way. The questions of someone who is not trying to find a weakness, but is genuinely trying to understand a structure because they believe the structure is sound and want to know it completely. At the end of 2 hours, Maylin looked at Eleanor and said, "We would like to discuss a significant commitment to the next fund round. We will not tell you what number we have in mind. We'll let you tell us what you need and we'll respond to that." Eleanor looked at her. "That is an unusual approach," Eleanor said. "We find it produces better partnerships," Maylin said. "We're not interested in leverage. We're interested in what you're building." Eleanor thought for a moment. Then she said, "I'll have Thomas send you the fund structure document by end of day Monday. The number we need is in it. It's a larger number than you might expect." "We expect large numbers," Jin-Ho Park said with the brief, warm smile of someone who means exactly what they say and nothing beyond it. After they left, Eleanor sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. She thought about 6 years ago when she had first started mapping out what would become the Hayes Foundation. She had been sitting at the desk in the Westchester study, the house that she had filled and managed and made livable, while Michael slept upstairs after a dinner party she had organized for 18 of his most important clients. She had been looking at a spreadsheet she had built from scratch, a model for something she couldn't yet name, and she had felt with the specific loneliness of a person whose most important thoughts happen only in the margins of other people's lives that she might be building towards something no one would ever see. She thought about that woman, the one at the desk at midnight alone with her spreadsheet. She wanted to tell her they see it now. They came from Singapore to see it. You did not build this for nothing. She did not let herself stay in that feeling for too long. There was too much to do. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. "Ms. Hayes," said a voice she recognized immediately, despite having heard it only twice before. "This is Richard Alcott." Eleanor looked at her phone. She had told Thomas to schedule Alcott last. She had not said anything about calls. "Mr. Alcott," she said, "I believe my office is handling scheduling through Thomas Reyes." "I know," Alcott said. He had the voice of a man who is accustomed to calling outside normal channels and having people accept it. "I apologize for the direct call. I wanted to speak with you personally before the formal meeting process." "All right," Eleanor said. Her voice was entirely neutral. "I want to say something," Alcott said, "and I want you to understand I'm not saying it as a preamble to a business conversation. I'm saying it because it's true and I believe it should be said." A pause. "Aspen," he said, 18 months ago, that dinner." Eleanor went very still. "I was extraordinarily rude to you," Alcott said. "I directed every substantive question to your husband. I effectively pretended you weren't in the room." Another pause. "I have thought about that evening more than once since I became aware of what you've built. And I want to tell you directly, not in a meeting, not in front of lawyers or advisors, that I was wrong, significantly and specifically wrong." The conference room was very quiet. Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment. "Mr. Alcott," she said, "I appreciate that." "I should have known better," he said. "I've been in this industry for 40 years. I have watched the system fail extraordinary people for 40 years. And then I sat across from you and participated in exactly the thing I've spent 40 years watching." His voice was not self-flagellating. It was factual. The tone of a man who has examined something and is reporting what he found. "I wanted you to know that I know that, before we have any conversation about the foundation." Eleanor thought for a moment. "The dinner in Aspen," she said. "Do you remember what the conversation was about, the one you were having with my husband?" "Emerging markets infrastructure," Alcott said. "There was a moment," Eleanor said, "about 40 minutes in. You were discussing the capital allocation problem in secondary cities. Michael said something about the pipeline bottleneck, and he wasn't wrong, but he was missing something." Alcott was quiet. "You were missing the last-mile operator problem," Eleanor said. "The reason capital doesn't reach secondary city infrastructure isn't the pipeline. It's that the operators who could manage the last mile don't have access to the capital to build the capacity to become the kind of operators that capital trusts." She paused. "I started to say that. Then someone asked Michael about the Whitmore Capital Emerging Markets Fund, and the conversation moved on." A silence. "You're right," Alcott said quietly. "That is exactly what we were missing." "I know," Eleanor said. Another silence. Ms. Hayes, Alcott said, I would very much like to be in the room for the next conversation, the real one. Schedule through Thomas, Eleanor said. You'll wait your turn. A beat. Of course, Alcott said. Thank you for taking my call. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. She had spent 12 years walking into rooms where men like Richard Alcott looked past her to the man beside her. She had spent 12 years being the person who started to say something and was talked over who knew the answer and was never asked the question, who understood the room better than anyone in it and was treated as decoration rather than intelligence. She was not angry about it, not anymore. Anger was for when you still needed things to be different in the past. Eleanor had stopped needing the past to be different. She had accepted it, worked through it, and used every single bit of it to build something that the Richard Alcotts of the world were now calling her to apologize for missing. She had her answer ready. She had been building her answer for 5 years. At 4 in the afternoon, she got the call she had not expected. It was Destiny Williams, calling from Nashville, from the offices of the healthcare logistics company that now processed emergency care claims for 40,000 rural patients, calling with a voice that had the particular warmth of someone who does not forget where their help came from. I saw the news, Destiny said. Everything that's been written this week. Ms. Hayes, A pause. She was, Eleanor could tell, working to stay composed. I didn't know. Before this week, I didn't fully understand the context of what you were doing, what it cost you, what the situation was. It doesn't change what I saw in your pitch deck, Eleanor said. I know, Destiny said, but I wanted to call because you believed in me when I had 17 rejections and no money, and I was about 2 weeks from giving up. Her voice was steady now, the composure of someone who has decided to say a thing clearly rather than emotionally. I want you to know that I'm standing in an office where 40 people are working right now, 40 people who have jobs because you made one phone call to Thomas Reyes and said yes, and I need you to know that I know that. Eleanor felt something move through her that she did not try to contain or manage. Thank you, Destiny, she said. Are you okay? Destiny asked. With all of it, the public side, it's a lot, Eleanor said honestly. It's more visibility than I planned for. Do you regret it? Destiny said. The gala, the award, all of it becoming public. Eleanor thought about this. She thought about the guest suite where she was sleeping. She thought about the kitchen that morning and the coffee in Michael's face. She thought about Priya Anand's mother and her second business venture and the 19 meeting requests and Richard Alcott calling outside normal channels to apologize for a dinner 18 months ago. She thought about the woman at the desk at midnight alone with her spreadsheet. No, she said. I don't regret it. Good, Destiny said. And there was something in the word simple, direct the warmth of someone who has been given a reason to believe in things and is telling you they're glad that settled something in Eleanor that she hadn't realized was still unsettled. She talked to Destiny for another 20 minutes about the January symposium and the keynote and the logistics of getting 40 people from Destiny's office to New York for the event, because Eleanor had already decided that Destiny's team would be there, all of them fully covered, because that was the kind of thing the Hayes Foundation did and would keep doing. After she hung up, she stood up from the conference room table. She walked to the window. She looked out at the city. Her city, the city she had moved through for 15 years in the shadow of someone else's name, and was now moving through slowly and irreversibly as herself. She thought about what came next. Not the meetings, not the fund round, not the legal process or the house or the logistics of dividing a life that had been shared for 12 years. She thought about the thing underneath all of that, the actual essential question of what she was building toward. She had started building the Hayes Foundation because she saw something that needed to be built. She had kept building it because she had refused to let the circumstances of her life be her ceiling. She had finished building it, at least this version of it, the first version, because she had understood at some point in the last 5 years that the most powerful thing she could do was not to fight for a seat at any existing table, but to build a table that hadn't existed before and invite to it the people who had been standing outside every other room. She was going to keep building. Different things, larger things, things she could not yet name because the names come after the foundation is laid, not before. But she was going to keep building. At 5:30, she picked up her bag. She walked out of the conference room, through the modest lobby of the building nobody had heard of, and out onto the street. Thomas was waiting on the steps. I was not supposed to be there. Call had ended at noon, and he had no reason to be here. He was simply here in the way that someone is simply there when they have decided that presence is the right thing to offer. Long day, he said. Productive, she said. He fell into step beside her. The Singapore group, he said. Monday, she said. Have the fund document ready. Done. A pause. Alcott called you directly. I know you know, she said. Are you annoyed? No, she said. He apologized. It was genuine. Thomas considered this. Alcott apologized. For Aspen. A pause. He remembered Aspen, Thomas said. He'd been thinking about it, Eleanor said, since he found out what we built. She paused. I think that matters. Not enough to move him to the front of the line, but enough to take the meeting seriously. They walked in silence for a moment. Eleanor, Thomas said. Yes. Are you all right? You all right? Not the foundation, not the meetings, you. She thought about Destiny's 40 employees, about the woman at midnight with the spreadsheet, about the kitchen this morning and Michael's face when she said the word divorce, the way something in him had cracked open, not collapsed, but opened the way a man looks when he finally sees something he should have seen years ago and finds to his own surprise that he is not too small to see it. I'm getting there, she said. It was the truest thing she had said all day. Thomas nodded. He did not push further. They walked another half block, and then he went his way, and she went hers, and the city moved around her in all its indifferent, magnificent noise, and Eleanor Hayes Whitmore walked through it, the way she had always walked through everything, with her head up, with her eyes open, with the particular and private composure of a woman who has done the hardest part already and knows that what comes next, whatever it is hers to build. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a city like New York. 6 months is not long enough for most things to change. But Eleanor Hayes Whitmore was not most things. By the following April, the name Eleanor Hayes, she had quietly, without announcement, without a press release, without any of the performative machinery of public reinvention, had separated itself from the name Whitmore in the way that clean water separates from something it has been mixed with for too long, not dramatically, not with visible effort, simply and completely the way natural things resolve when you stop forcing them into an unnatural shape. The divorce had been finalized in February. It had taken 4 months, which for a dissolution of 12 years of marriage and the financial complexity that came with it was extraordinarily fast. Jonathan Price told 3 of his colleagues privately that it was the most civilized divorce proceeding he had been part of in 31 years of practice. Patricia Voss said nothing about it to anyone because she was not that kind of lawyer, but she did take the framed settlement document home and put it in the cabinet where she kept the handful of cases she was most proud of. Michael had been, as he had promised, honest. He had not fought the property division. He had not attempted to complicate the financial separation. He had not, as Eleanor had been quietly prepared for, tried to use the legal process as leverage or as theater. He had shown up to every required meeting, answered every required question, and signed every required document with the focused, unperformative attention of a man who has decided that the only thing left he can do correctly is this, and who is determined to do it correctly. Eleanor had not hated him for any of it. She had not loved him for it either. She had simply accepted it as what it was, a man doing the right thing too late, which is not the same as not doing the right thing, and deserves, if not forgiveness exactly, at least the acknowledgement of its own category. Patricia, in their last meeting before the finalization, had looked at Eleanor across the conference table and said, "You know, in 30 years I have watched a lot of people go through this process. Most of them come out the other side diminished somehow, smaller." Eleanor had looked at her. "You're not smaller," Patricia said. I don't have a better word for it. You're just more." Eleanor had thanked her. She had meant it. The Hayes Foundation's symposium in January had been the first major public event she had attended entirely as herself, not as anyone's wife, not as a supporting presence in someone else's narrative. As Eleanor Hayes, founder and chair of the Hayes Foundation for Future Leaders, host of the 2-day gathering of 73 people that she had spent 3 months assembling with the same care and specificity she gave to everything. Destiny Williams had given the keynote. She had stood at the podium in a conference room at a hotel in Midtown, not the Waldorf, not anywhere that carried the weight of someone else's world. Just a clean, serious room that Eleanor had chosen because it was the right size and the right temperature and had the right acoustics, and she had talked for 47 minutes about what it costs to build something when the system has decided you are not the kind of person who builds things. Eleanor sat in the front row and listened to every word. She had heard Destiny's story before in pieces over 14 months of quarterly calls and site visits, and the quiet, consistent relationship that the Hayes Foundation built with every company it backed. But she had not heard it like this in full, in public, in the voice of a woman who had decided that her story was not a private thing anymore, that it belonged to everyone in the room who needed to hear it. 40 Minutes in Destiny looked directly at Eleanor. "There is a woman in this room," Destiny said, "who called me on a Tuesday afternoon 18 months ago and said I remember the exact words, 'I've read your deck 3 times. I think you're solving the right problem. Let's talk about what you need.'" She paused. Nobody had ever said that to me before. Nobody had ever said the right problem. Everyone else had told me I was solving a problem that wasn't scalable or wasn't commercial or wasn't the kind of thing that serious investors put money into. She looked at Eleanor steadily. One person looked at what I was building and saw it clearly, and that clarity changed 40,000 patients' access to emergency care. The room was completely silent. "I'm not telling this story to be grateful," Destiny said. "I'm telling it because I want everyone in this room who has been told their problem isn't serious to understand something. The problem is serious. The question is whether the person across the table is capable of seeing it." She looked out over the audience. "Find the people who can see it. And when you find them, hold on to them, because they are rarer than money and more valuable than any check." The applause that followed was not polite. It was the kind that comes from the chest, not the hands. Eleanor accepted it without standing, without performing, without doing anything other than sitting in the front row and being present for a moment that she had, in some important sense, spent 5 years building toward, without knowing exactly what shape it would take when it arrived. Thomas leaned over from the seat beside her and said quietly, "How does it feel?" She thought about the question. "Like something I can't go back from," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. Going back was never the right direction. The second day of the symposium was where the unexpected thing happened. It was not on the schedule. It was not something Eleanor had planned or anticipated or would have planned if she had thought of it, because it came from a direction she had not been watching. At 9:15 in the morning, before the first session started, a woman approached Eleanor in the corridor outside the main room. She was in her mid-30s, professionally dressed, with the slightly overcomposed expression of someone who has been working up to something and has decided they have run out of time to keep working up to it. "Ms. Hayes," she said, "I'm sorry to catch you like this. My name is Priya Anand. We spoke on the phone in October." Eleanor recognized the name immediately. "The Meridian piece," she said. "Yes." Priya paused. "I came to the symposium as press. I have a credential. I need to tell you something." She stopped, looked at Eleanor directly. "My mother called me the night my piece ran. She called me at 11 at night, which she never does. She said she had read it 3 times. Eleanor waited. "She said she had printed it out and put it on the wall of her shop." Priya's composure, the professional composure she had been maintaining, slipped slightly at the edges. "She's been running a small alterations and tailoring business for 22 years, in Queens. She came here from India with my father and $42, and she built that business with her hands and her brain, and she's extraordinary. And for 22 years, she's been invisible." Priya looked at Eleanor. "My piece was about you, but she said it made her feel seen. For the first time in 22 years, she felt seen." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "What's her name?" Eleanor said. "Sunita," Priya said. "Sunita Anand." "Tell me about her business," Eleanor said. Priya blinked. She does alterations and custom tailoring. She has 4 employees. She's been trying to expand for 3 years, but she can't get a small business loan because her revenue model doesn't fit the standard. "Because her revenue is relationship-based," Eleanor said. "Repeat clients' word of mouth, seasonal variation. Banks model for consistency, and she models for loyalty." She looked at Priya. "How long have you been trying to help her find financing?" 2 years, Priya said quietly. Eleanor pulled out her phone. She opened her calendar. She looked at it for a moment. "Have your mother call Thomas Reyes's office on Monday. Tell him I sent her." She looked up. The Hayes Foundation doesn't typically work at this scale, but we have a small business access program that I've been building for exactly this situation, and Sunita Anand sounds like exactly the person it was built for. Priya stared at her. I'm not, she started. I'm press. I'm here as press. I wasn't trying to. I know you weren't, Eleanor said. That's why I'm saying yes. She put her phone away. Also, she said, I'd like to talk to you after the first session, not for a story. I've been thinking about the Meridian piece since October, and I have some thoughts about a longer project that might interest you, but that's a separate conversation. Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who came to a door expecting it to be closed and found it not only open, but illuminated. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes. Eleanor smiled. Monday, she said. Thomas's office. She walked into the main room. Thomas, who had been standing close enough to hear the end of the conversation, fell into step beside her. Sunita Anand, he said. Small Business Access Program, Eleanor said. Monday. The program isn't fully launched yet, Thomas said. Then it launches Monday, Eleanor said. Thomas wrote it in his notebook without another word, because he had learned in 7 years that Eleanor's timelines were not suggestions. The next twist came in March and nobody saw it coming, not even Thomas. It came in the form of a phone call from a woman named Margaret Cho, who was the chief investment officer of a pension fund that managed the retirement assets of 1.2 million public school teachers across 4 states. Margaret Cho was 58 years old, had been in institutional finance for 30 years, and was not someone who called people directly. She had people who called people. She called Eleanor directly. I'm going to explain why I'm calling outside normal channels, Margaret said immediately before Eleanor could say anything beyond hello. Because I want you to understand this is not a normal inquiry. All right, Eleanor said. I have been watching the Hayes Foundation since before the gala, Margaret said. Since before the Times piece. Since 14 months ago, when one of your board members, I won't say who, mentioned you in a conversation I was not supposed to be paying attention to. I started watching then. Eleanor said nothing. She was listening. The fund structure you've built, Margaret said, specifically the evaluation methodology for founders in the competence gap. You called it that in an interview last month, and I've been using the phrase in every meeting since it is the most rigorous and the most human thing I have seen in impact investment in 20 years. Thank you, Eleanor said. I'm not calling to compliment you, Margaret said. I'm calling because I represent 1.2 million teachers. People who built their lives in classrooms who were told for their entire careers that their work was important but not valuable. People who are, in the most literal sense, the reason anyone in any boardroom can read. A pause. I want their retirement money to fund the next Destiny Williams. I want their money building what the traditional system can't see, and I want it managed by someone who has spent 5 years proving she can see what the traditional system can't. The number Margaret said next was not the largest number Eleanor had heard in her career, but it was the number that meant something different from all the others, because it wasn't capital from a family office protecting generational wealth. It wasn't a strategic investment from a group protecting market position. It was the savings of people who had spent 30 years in classrooms, and Margaret Cho was sitting across a phone line in Chicago, asking Eleanor to be responsible for it. Eleanor held the phone very carefully. I need you to send me everything, she said. The fund structure, the teacher pool demographics, the liability parameters, the board governance requirements. I need to look at all of it before I say anything. I expected that, Margaret said. If the structure works, Eleanor said, if the fiduciary obligations can be met within the Hayes Foundation's framework, and I'm not promising they can, I need to see the numbers, then I would like to have a longer conversation. That's all I'm asking for, Margaret said. The longer conversation. After she hung up, Eleanor sat in her office, the proper office now in the proper building, not the guest suite or the Westchester study, and she looked at the wall across from her desk. She had put one thing on that wall, not a degree, not an award, not a photograph of herself at any podium, a printout of a spreadsheet. The original model she had built 6 years ago at midnight in the Westchester study, while Michael slept upstairs, and the dinner party she had organized was still being cleaned up by the catering staff downstairs. The original model, with all its imprecisions and early-stage roughness, printed on 3 sheets of paper and taped to the wall. She looked at it, She thought 1.2 million teachers. She thought this is what the margin of your life looks like when you refuse to let it stay marginal. She called Thomas. "Margaret Cho," she said when he answered. A pause. "The pension fund," Thomas said. She called me directly. Another pause longer. Thomas Reyes, the most unflappable man in private wealth management, was quiet for 4 full seconds. "How large?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for another 3 seconds. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. "This changes the scope of everything," he said. "If we can structure this, if the fiduciary framework works, this is not a regional impact fund anymore. This is—" "I know what it is," she said. "Let's make sure we can do it right before we say what it is out loud." "Of course," Thomas said. "I'll have a structural analysis to you by Thursday." "Wednesday," she said. "Wednesday," he said without hesitation. She hung up. She sat with the weight of the number and the weight of the responsibility and the weight of 1.2 million people who had spent their lives in classrooms, and she felt something she recognized from the very beginning of all of this. Not triumph, not vindication, purpose. The clear, specific, load-bearing feeling of knowing exactly what you are for and being in the precise position to be it. She had not felt it in the Westchester house. She had not felt it standing next to Michael at any gala or dinner party or charity event or industry function she had attended in 12 years. She had felt it at midnight with a spreadsheet. She felt it now in her own office with her own name on the door, with the original model on the wall, and 1.2 million teachers on the phone, and 47 founders already changed, and 40,000 patients already reached. She was 44 years old. She was just getting started. In April, a journalist from the Harvard Business Review called to ask if Eleanor would contribute to a piece about non-traditional investment methodologies. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 days and then called back and said she would not contribute to a piece, but she would write her own. The piece ran in the May issue. It was 11 pages long, and it did not read like a business school paper. It read like something between a philosophy and a field manual, the kind of writing that only happens when someone has been living inside an idea for long enough that the idea has become inseparable from their experience of reality. The central argument was simple. The greatest source of untapped investment potential in the American economy is not a sector or a geography or a technology. It is a category of human being, specifically the category of person who has the competence to build something extraordinary and lacks the credentials, the connections, or the physical proximity to the people with capital that the traditional system requires in order to take a person seriously. The piece named this category. Eleanor called them the invisible builders. She wrote, "They are everywhere. They are in classrooms and kitchens and garages and community centers. They are solving problems that the people with capital have never had because the people with capital have never lived in the communities where those problems exist. They have been pitching to the wrong rooms for so long that some of them have stopped pitching. Our job is not to find them. They are not lost. Our job is to become the kind of institution they can find when they are ready to be found." The piece was shared 47,000 times in the first week. The number was not an accident. Thomas noticed it and texted her 47. Like the founders. She texted back, "I know. I planned it." The piece was 47 pages in draft. "I cut it to 11 specifically." He replied with the single word, "Of course you did." On the last Friday in April, Eleanor Hayes had lunch with 3 women. Dr. Amara Osei, who had been with the Hayes Foundation from the beginning and whose presence on the board had lent it in the early years the credibility that Eleanor's own name had not yet accumulated. Destiny Williams, who had flown up from Nashville for a board meeting and stayed an extra day because she wanted to be in the room when the announcement was made. And Priya Anand, who was no longer covering Eleanor as a journalist. She had 3 months ago made a decision that surprised her editor and did not surprise Eleanor at all, and who was now the Hayes Foundation's first director of storytelling, a role Eleanor had created because she understood that what gets built only matters if people know it was built and what it cost to build it. They sat at a corner table in a restaurant that Eleanor liked for its noise level and its lack of pretension, and the fact that the owner had been a Hayes Foundation referral before the Hayes Foundation was publicly known, a man named Carlos, who had built a supply chain company out of a shared workspace in the Bronx and now operated in 6 cities. Carlos came to the table himself to say hello. He looked at Eleanor with the expression that several of the 47 founders had when they encountered her in person, not quite awe, something more grounded than awe, something closer to the particular gratitude of someone who knows exactly which door had been locked and exactly who had opened it. "You doing okay?" he said to her. "Better than okay," she said. "I heard about the pension fund," he said. She looked at him. "How?" He smiled. "Thomas mentioned it to my CFO at a conference." He shrugged the shrug of a man who moves in circles now that he did not move in before and who has not forgotten where he started. "Is it happening?" "We're still working through the structure," she said. "But it's happening," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "It's happening," she said. He nodded. He went back to his work. At the table over food that nobody really focused on because the conversation was too alive to leave room for attention to anything else, Amara said, "I want to know something. I've been wanting to ask for months." "Ask," Eleanor said. "The night of the gala," Amara said. "When Victoria called your name. When you walked in and saw Michael there with—" She paused delicately. "When you saw the full situation, what did you feel?" The table was quiet. Eleanor thought about the question with her characteristic care. "Tired," she said. Amara blinked. "Tired." "Not in a bad way," Eleanor said. "Tired like you feel at the end of something very long that you did well, the way you feel crossing a finish line after a race that took everything you had." She paused. "I had been carrying the weight of being underestimated for so long that when the weight finally lifted, when I walked into that room, and I knew that no matter what happened in the next 2 hours, I had already built something real, what I felt was tired and light in the same moment." Priya was writing nothing down. She didn't need to. She was storing it in the place where the most important things get stored, not in notes, but in the body. "What about Michael?" Destiny said. Eleanor looked at her. "What do you feel when you think about him now?" Destiny said. She was young enough and honest enough to ask the question the others were being too politic to ask. Eleanor considered. "Sadness," she said, "for both of us, for what we could have been to each other if either of us had been more honest sooner." She paused. "He wasn't a villain. He was a man who got very good at not looking at things that were inconvenient to look at. And I was a woman who got very good at not demanding to be looked at." She looked at Destiny. "That's not a story about a monster. It's a story about two people who failed each other in ways that were slow and quiet and very hard to notice until they were complete." The table was quiet for a moment. "But you're okay," Amara said. Not a question. "I'm better than okay," Eleanor said. She meant it this time the way she had not entirely meant it when she said it to Carlos. She meant it in the full tested, arrived-at way of someone who has passed through something genuinely difficult and come out on the other side, carrying nothing from before except what was worth keeping. 1 week later, the structural analysis from Thomas confirmed what she had been hoping. The pension fund partnership was viable. The fiduciary framework could be built to satisfy the liability requirements. The governance structure Thomas had designed was cleaner and more protective than anything either of them had expected. The numbers worked. The risk profile worked. The alignment between the teacher's long-term interests and the Hayes Foundation's investment thesis worked in a way that was almost, Thomas said in the cover note, as if Eleanor had designed the foundation 6 years ago with exactly this partnership in mind. She had not. But she had designed it to be true enough, rigorous enough, and human enough that it could hold the weight of any partnership that was worth having. That was the same thing. She called Margaret Cho. "The analysis is done," Eleanor said. "The structure works. I'd like to move to the next conversation." Margaret Cho, the woman who had 30 years in institutional finance and who called chief investment officers through assistants and intermediaries, said, "When can you be in Chicago?" "Thursday," Eleanor said. "Thursday." Margaret agreed. She flew to Chicago on Thursday morning. She sat across from Margaret Cho in a conference room that overlooked Lake Michigan, and for 3 hours they talked not about numbers, though the numbers were there, not about structure, though the structure had been approved, but about what it means to be responsible for something. For people who trusted you with something precious, for the shape of the future that their money was going to help build. Margaret said near the end of the 3 hours, "Why teachers? Why does this feel right to you, personally?" Eleanor looked at her. "My third-grade teacher's name was Mrs. Patricia Carroll," Eleanor said. She was the first person outside my family who told me I was capable of something specific. Not just smart in the general way people say to children. Specifically capable. She told me I must have been 8. She said, "Eleanor, you see things that other people don't see yet, and you need to learn to trust that." She paused. I spent about 30 years not trusting it, and then I started trusting it, and this is what happened when I did. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Patricia Carroll," Margaret said. "I don't know where she is now," Eleanor said. "I've thought about trying to find her, to tell her." "Find her," Margaret said. "Tell her." The partnership was signed in May. It was not announced publicly for another 3 months because Eleanor wanted the structural foundation to be fully operational before the world started watching it, because she had learned in 5 years of building quietly, in 12 years of being underestimated, in 44 years of understanding that what is real does not require announcement to be real, that the most important things are always built before they are seen. On the morning the announcement was made, Eleanor was not in a boardroom. She was at her desk in her office in the building with her name on the door, looking at the original spreadsheet on the wall. Priya knocked and came in. "It's out," she said. Eleanor nodded. "Your phone is going to be impossible in about 4 minutes," Priya said. "I know," Eleanor said. She looked at the spreadsheet. She thought about the woman who had built it. The woman at midnight in someone else's house in the margins of someone else's life, building something that nobody knew about and that might never be seen building it anyway because it needed to be built, and she was the one who could see how. She thought about Thomas saying going back was never the right direction. She thought about Destiny's 40,000 patients. She thought about Sunita Anand's shop in Queens and the printout on the wall. She thought about 1.2 million teachers who had spent their lives making sure that the children who sat in front of them became the kind of people who could build things worth building. She thought about Mrs. Patricia Carroll. She had found her 3 weeks ago in a retirement community in Connecticut. She was 81 years old. She had taught 3rd grade for 38 years. She did not remember Eleanor. She had taught thousands of children, and Eleanor was to her one of the thousands. But she had listened on the phone with the patient, warm attention of a woman who had spent 38 years listening to children. And when Eleanor finished telling her what she had built and why there was a silence on the line. And then Mrs. Carroll had said in the voice of someone who is very old and very tired and very glad, "I always knew the quiet ones were the ones to watch." Eleanor had written that down. She had put it under the spreadsheet on the wall. Now she looked at both of them. Priya was still in the doorway. "You okay?" Priya said. Eleanor turned. She looked at this young woman who had written a piece about cost and been right about all of it, who had brought her mother's story to a corridor in Midtown and changed the shape of her own life in the process, who was now the person responsible for making sure the world understood what was being built and why it mattered and what it had cost to build it. "Yes," Eleanor said. Her phone started ringing. She looked at it, looked back at the spreadsheet, looked at Mrs. Carroll's words underneath it. Then she picked up the phone. She said Eleanor Hayes, not Whitmore, not Michael Whitmore's wife, not the woman in the background of someone else's story. Eleanor Hayes, full stop. Her name, her voice, her work, her world. She had not taken it back. She had simply remembered she had never given it away. That was the thing about Eleanor Hayes, the thing that the Financial Times piece had gotten close to, but not all the way to the thing that Priya's piece had understood more deeply, the thing that Mrs. Carroll had known when Eleanor was 8 years old, and the thing that the original spreadsheet had always been evidence of. She had never stopped being exactly who she was. She had simply been waiting with the patience of someone who understands that the most powerful things are built slowly and held quietly and released only when they are ready for the world to catch up. It had caught up. And Eleanor Hayes was already 3 steps ahead, building the next thing, the larger thing, the thing that nobody had seen coming. The way she had always built, the way she would always build. Not because anyone was watching, because she could see what needed to be built. And that had always been enough.